Everybody's heard about the bird. Bird, bird, bird. The bird's a word. Well, a bird, bird, bird. Bird is a word. Well, a bird, bird, bird. Well, a bird is a word. Well, a bird, bird, bird. The bird's a word. Well, a bird, bird, bird. Well, a bird is a word. Well, a bird, bird. The bird's a word. Well, don't you know about the bird? Well, everybody knows that the bird is a word. Well, a bird.
Hello, welcome to MennoNerds with New Directions. I'm Jenn Yoder. I blog over at Queer Menno, and I'm a co-founder of Pink Menno. And I would like to invite our guests to introduce themselves. If you'd like, if you could also say how you identify, that would be great as well. Welcome, and feel free to introduce yourselves.
I get to go first? Yeah. My name is Denise. I am the coordinator for youth services for New Direction. I identify as queer, but lesbian. I just like the word queer, and use feminine pronouns, she, her.
My name is Beth, and I am Denise's wife, and also the director of community for New Direction, and I identify as gay. You know, I use she and her as well.
And I'm Wendy. I've been the executive director at New Direction since 2002. And I describe myself as mainly straight, depending on the day. And pretty much any pronoun would be fine with me, but typically it's she or her. And mostly cisgender.
Excellent. And I failed to do the same. I'm identify as queer and genderqueer. I use they and them, but also respond to she and her just fine. Okay, well, how about for people who haven't been researching and reading everything you're putting out and checking your Twitter feed, if you could just give a little bit of a history of your organization for folks, just a little overview, whatever you're ready to share.
I often say that New Direction has a notorious history, and it's one that is painful to own but important to own, and part of owning it is seeking to be a living apology. So it started in 1985, and it was an ex-gay ministry and part of Exodus International. I came in 2002, and pretty quickly we were questioning a reparative paradigm. The expectation of our board and constituency was that we would continue to hold a traditionally believing view of marriage. And in 2010, I gathered a group of stakeholders across Canada to ask about this concept I was percolating on called generous spaciousness. And in this posture, we wanted to nurture room for people who were grappling with the scriptures in different ways and holding different interpretations and responding to the question of what faithful discipleship for sexual minority and gender minority folks looked like. That got us in a whole heap of trouble. We lost 50% of our support, and for a while I was the only staff member. But generous spaciousness gets us in trouble with those on the far right and the far left, but it's our attempt to create a humanizing community where we can be honest about where we are in the journey, the questions we're asking, how we're seeking to discern our own spiritual lives, and how we can be together in community, transcending our differences. And in the midst of that, our hope is to be an increasingly safe and spacious place for people, regardless of how they identify, regardless of where they are in the journey. We try to focus on these three questions. If you want to seek or pursue deeper relationship with Jesus, you know, our community might be a place for you. Secondly, if you're willing to listen deeply to others and be willing to forfeit your compulsion to try to convince everybody else to think just like you do, our community might be a place for you. And then third, if you'll do your very best to be attuned and sensitive to do no harm in our community, not that we do that perfectly, but really being aware of one another. If you can be affirmative in those three questions, then come journey with us. And we try to see the diversity of perspective not as a problem to fix, but as an opportunity to be enlarged in our capacity to make room for each other, to be gracious to one another, to listen, to be patient, to forgive. And so that's where we find ourselves today. Our communities have grown to the degree that we needed to hire Beth to come on as Director of Community this past summer. And of course, we're deeply concerned about the dilemmas of queer youth, particularly in the realm of high-risk behaviors and homelessness. And so we're thrilled that both Beth and Denise have come to help us in those two areas of ministry that are just growing by leaps and bounds.
Awesome, thank you. Did you have anything you wanted to add before I respond, Denise or Beth?
Sounded good to me. we're quite new to the organization, so to be honest, we're still kind of figuring things out ourselves and meeting people in the community who've been involved longer than we have. So we're excited about sort of our particular areas, but also trying to get a handle on what it's all about, and that's been sort of a learning curve for us. Yep.
Great. Well, you touched on a few things that I definitely noticed and I'm interested in talking more about as I was checking out your website and looking into your history and the work that you're doing. So I'm trying to think where to start here. I guess I would ask, I'm really interested, you talked a lot about generous spaciousness, and it reminds me a lot of some conversations we're having in Pink Menno around brave spaces, is what we call them. We got that from a couple academics who did a study about safe spaces, so I can't claim that we came up with brave spaces, but what it integrates is they found that in safe spaces, which is kind of common language, generally people who have been marginalized and experienced oppression are looking for a space where they can be safe to call out harm when they see it or to ask for adjustments. But then often people from a more sort of privileged perspective are looking for a space where they can be safe to say whatever they want without any accountability. So they were finding, because people are coming in looking for these two very different things, safe spaces haven't been working out for sort of either party. And so brave spaces, the idea would be that we share vulnerability, which it sounds like you're talking about in generous spaciousness as well. And we come into the space with the tools that we have and the language we have and the experiences that we have. But then we also share accountability, so we are willing to say, hey, I think you kind of made a mistake there, and we're willing to hear, hey, I think you kind of made a mistake. So I guess I would ask how that's lived in this generous spaciousness. So if you're talking to a group of people together and someone does say something harmful, how you do that accountability holding, and whether that works for people or if they feel that takes away the generosity or the safety of the space for that.
I'm going to take a first step.
Yeah, I think, first of all, I think the term brave space is really interesting as well. We were actually just talking before this podcast about our term generous space and how it does avoid some of the misconceptions around the word safe, because I think when you say safe, people have certain expectations that you can't always achieve because we're human and we all make mistakes. So I think generous for us accomplishes some of the same things that brave might for your group.
Although, for the record, I'm kind of jealous. I really
Brave spaciousness. That's even the
I'm sure you could use it.
It's probably not copyrighted yet, right? So I think, and I think what you're talking about is really giving the benefit of the doubt. It's sort of recognizing that we all come as people who make mistakes and trying to come with certain postures. So when Wendy wrote her book about generous spaciousness, she talked about 4 postures and 4 values that are sort of central for us, and one is humility, hospitality, mutuality, and justice. So we try to frame our conversations in our community times around those values. And I think in the specific case that you bring up where somebody has felt hurt by somebody else, it's exactly what you've been talking about. It's approaching it from a posture of humility and saying, you know what, all of us make mistakes. We all, we use the wrong pronouns. We use language that's not affirming and dignifying for each other. Sometimes out of ignorance, sometimes out of our own hurt, and so we can acknowledge that. And then I think just trying to be vulnerable and honest with each other, and hospitality is about inviting each other into vulnerable spaces. So so I think all of those, and justice, I think, is another value that we sometimes struggle with because we have different ideas about what justice looks like. But one thing that Wendy's often quoting, I think, is it Desmond Tutu, who says, "If I diminish you, I diminish myself." And so we kind of try to revolve around some of those ideas of being in it together as humans, and how do we treat each other in ways that are dignifying and honoring of one another's humanity. You want to add to that? For you?
Beth did a great job, but I think inherent in that is being a learning community.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're intentionally hosting a very diverse group of people who seek to be allies, but maybe are stumbling along trying to figure out what that is, people who are out, people who are trying to figure out if they want to come out, people who are partially out, people who are very much in a bit of a fluid space and trying to figure that out. The idea that we are committed to learning together is, I think, one of the ways that we're able to ask simple questions of each other. Tell me more about that, instead of assuming a lot packed into one sentence. I think also risking to be honest, to say, we just had a gathering last night, and one of our participants felt at one point that our humor was becoming alienating. And he had the courage to speak up and say, it's getting to the point where, humor is something that is intimate and shared by family and people who know each other and love each other, but I think it's going too far. And we were able to affirm that honesty and, look within and have a very, I think, fruitful conversation about that. So if we're learning how to be more humanizing of one another, then I think we're at least moving in a good direction. Mm-hmm. Maybe a new direction.
Nicely done.
Wes would be pleased. I'm sorry that Wes can't be joining us, but he is the punniest of all of us, so that one was for Wes.
Excellent. Yeah, that really, it does, I think, aligns really well with the brave spaces and generous spaces. Especially when you talked about the courage to be honest. I think it's that piece of bravery, and it's that piece of sharing vulnerability, which I think can be a really difficult thing when you're in a situation that could. So a lot of queer folks have experienced a lot of harm at the hands of maybe even well-intentioned Christians who have really strong beliefs. And so it can be hard to be in a space with folks who maybe remind you of those past experiences of harm, and to still speak into that space with bravery and vulnerability. So I applaud that effort at Generous Spaces there.
Well, it's interesting because our communities are diverse also in church background and worship style. We find even among our queer folks that one who comes from a Pentecostal background might start praying in a manner that's a huge trigger for somebody else. And wow, how do you criticize someone's prayer? Like, and so there, you can't underestimate how significant being attuned is, and being willing to relinquish. And saying, okay, this isn't about me and my way of praying. I choose to strip myself of the privilege of holding on to that for the sake of my sister or brother, maybe someone who believes very differently than I do. Like, holy crap, that's calling people to a deeper maturity that I think a lot of the church really wrestles with.
Absolutely. So I'm not quite sure how to ask this question, but you mentioned Desmond Tutu, so I'm gonna jump from there and mention one of my favorite quotes of his is the if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you've chosen the side of the oppressor. And then with that lovely metaphor, if an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse and you say you're neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality. So when you're trying to create a space where everyone feels brave enough to be present in that space, I think, I guess, how do you balance not being neutral, so honoring that one group of people have been particularly harmed in these conversations? How do you balance that with creating space for people who have, I don't like to use side language, but for people who have been part of causing the harm, or who hold opinions even that can just on their own feel harmful? Did that question make sense with all the interruptions?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I'll take a step first, just because I've been around ballgame a little longer, and then I'm thrilled to hear what Beth and James want to add. I said this recently when Mark Herder interviewed me, and she said, are you not making room for oppression? And the reality is you either make space for those who see marriage equality and spaciousness around gender and sexuality as God honoring, or you don't. And so in that sense, New Direction and generous space isn't neutral. We make that space. And there are certainly people who would say to me, Wendy, I'm excluded from generous spaciousness because I can't make space for that. And I, in my gracious Christian talk, say something really nice, but in my head I say, well, it sucks to be you. I mean, it's okay. You go have your conversation somewhere else. That's a non-negotiable for us. I think another thing is that our communities tend to flip the majority. So those who have been often marginalized and in the minority are in the majority, and those who are people of privilege and used to being in the normative majority voice suddenly find themselves, perhaps for the first time, feeling like they're the minority. So there is, I think, just intrinsically these really interesting power dynamics that are transformational without a single word being spoken. I quote, not that this is a battle of the quotes, but I quote Miroslav Volf a lot when he says, the harder I pursue justice, the blinder I become to the injustice that I myself perpetuate. And so what happens when we have different ideas about justice? And how do I not, in my desire for movement towards a justice that deeply matters to me, how do I not become an oppressor to someone else? And that idea leads us to try to reframe what justice means within our community. And one of the ways that we've talked about it is the pursuit of shalom. And in shalom, everyone has opportunity to flourish. And so the work of justice is me participating with others to dismantle the barriers that prevent others from flourishing. That's not a perfect response. People who pit religious liberty against civil rights for LGBT people, I just so think that's the wrong argument. Nobody wins. It just creates this scenario of violence. But if we ask the question, tell me about the barriers that you're experiencing in your life, and will you help me to know the best way that I can participate with you so that I'm moving with you to dismantle those barriers instead of maybe inadvertently contributing to those barriers, then it's a conversation we can have together instead of sort of shouting across the table about what justice is. So that's sort of the theoretical piece. But for you guys, how does that flesh out in? I mean, I was amazed that, and it was my naivete, but we did this epic road trip, and Beth and Denise and Wes as well told their story in venue after venue after venue after venue. And Beth especially would talk about, you know, wrestling with Scripture and wrestling with God and taking the risk and deciding to marry Denise. And then she would usually say something along the lines of, I could be wrong, and I respect my queer sisters and brothers who are committed to celibacy. And I sat there thinking, as a mainly straight gal, I bet the straight people in the room have no frickin' clue what that costs to even say that. Like, it just doesn't come into the mindset of someone who's in the majority privileged position. So you guys have lived this tension in a way that's much more personal than it is for me. So what additional insights would you add?
I think at least, I mean, especially when we're talking about the road trip, where we kind of did like 24 events in 21 days. So we were kind of like rock stars. But especially in that context where we were coming from, we were going into communities that were not our own, and we were able to kind of call them out a little bit. And so I think our role in that is to kind of call out people's privilege a little bit and to say, like, hey, maybe you haven't realized this, but if you have the people in your congregation and you are a more conservative church or whatever, wherever you are, you're not an affirming of same-sex marriage church, to be able to say, that's not a problem, like, that's actually a shocking thing to me. Like, those queer folks who want to worship with you, that's an enormous gift. And if you don't see it that way, then you absolutely don't deserve them. And so for us to be able to kind of have that voice, as especially Beth and I, as queer people who are not a part of those communities, I think that was special, because I don't know that I could say that in any of the churches that I grew up in the same way, because it is, so much more of a vulnerability.
Yeah, I think I really do sympathize with the quote that you read about neutrality. But I think that there's no way for us to meet each other if we can't have this space in the middle that we hold. And so we have to be able to share stories and do that in a way that's not immediately putting up our hands and saying, I can't be in the same space as you because you're on the other side from me. So I think what we're trying to do with New Direction and the communities that we're building is to find that middle ground where we can hear each other without first putting the blinders and the earplugs in and saying, no, I can't do this, and trying to see what's behind the opinions that we hold and the theology that we have, and to really understand it at a deeper level. So I don't think that is totally neutrality. I think it's sort of a middle space, like almost a no man's land, that you can kind of meet each other on, so that you can not have both sides of your mind closed, and so that you can kind of take in information that you wouldn't otherwise have if you didn't have that chance. So that's kind of how I picture it in my head.
I think also there are some non-negotiables in terms of how we shape conversation together. So, you know, every human being created in the image of God with inherent dignity and value, non-negotiable. Salvation, justification, whatever people want to call it, is a free gift of grace fully accomplished in Christ. So orientation or decisions about marriage or relationship or sexual behavior, none of those things get added to that. Paul said to the Galatians, don't castrate yourself if you're going to add circumcision to the free gift of this justification and reconciliation that Jesus has already accomplished for us. So, you know, there are some non-negotiables that maybe, again, maybe people who sort of are way on that end wouldn't come into our spaces anyway, because we're the Antichrist to them. But, I think there are facilitators within the community who are, our radar is up to say, sorry, that's a non-negotiable here. That's an essential that, if you want to have a different conversation with say, me one-on-one about that stuff, okay, but that's not coming into our community because it's just too violent. It's it's not redeemable in the sense of in these moments. I can't even put into words. It's like, so in that sense, there are boundaries. But the boundaries are also things that we discern as we are together, not some theoretical line in the sand out in the blue yonder.
So it's not a space where it's like anything goes, and if someone, no matter what anyone says, it's welcome there. It's a space with, as you were talking about, graciousness for mistakes and for disagreements, but it's not anything goes, and that's sort of a key distinction.
It's also not tolerance, in the sense that tolerance sort of has this expectation of a superficial equality of all of ideas and opinions. Hospitality is quite different than that. Hospitality doesn't think all ideas are the same. It says, come into my home, to my table where I break bread as, in some ways, as a sacrament of God's presence. And in that space, let us listen and share and wait on God together. And it might be very robust, and it might be very animated and very passionate. But it's not just this weird, relativistic, wishy-washy, let's sing Kumbaya with arms. Nobody grows that way. We don't actually pursue truth. It's not humanizing to have that sort of weird, la-di-da, everything's okay, I'm okay, you're okay, la la la. But we want to pursue something deeper and richer and much more life-giving than that. And that means sometimes people get pissed off and leave our community. And my sort of rule of thumb is there is a standing invitation for you to have dinner with me. You have to refuse to have dinner with me. I won't refuse to have dinner with you. But if you walk away and refuse to have dinner with me, God bless you, grace be with you. I hope God shows up in creative and interesting and unpredictable ways in your life, but I'm not going to, weep and gnash my teeth, hoping that you come back. There's lots of other people that God's calling me to be present with that I will be stretched by and learn from and so on. So, very early on in this, I felt God say, look, don't bash your head against the door that's bolted from the inside. Go to the doors that are a crack open, because you have one life, time is short. Like, this is hard work, but it doesn't have to be stupidly hard.
I think you might have some wisdom that leadership in the Mennonite Church could benefit from. Can I have them call you? Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Let's see. I guess I'm curious about the kinds of work that you do, the people that you work with, the places you get invited, or
disinvite.
I saw, or invite yourselves to, or however that works.
Or crash. Or get kicked out.
I saw this list on your website of like you work with denominations and prison clergy, and I remember the entire list right now, but I saw this list. I guess could you give a couple examples of consulting you've done or conversations you've led? The end.
Talk about the kinds of folks who would connect with us around one-on-one pastoral care, and then I'll talk maybe about sort of institutional. Sure. Yeah.
You want to go first with you?
Sure. Yeah, so I have, I work with youth primarily, but although that kind of branches out to other people that work with youth as well. So a lot of youth pastors, or even like teachers in Christian schools. The other day, I went out for a coffee with a guy that kind of out of the blue emailed me. I knew he was a youth pastor, and that's it. And I kind of assumed that he was coming from one of two places. He was either going to be queer himself, and he was going to come out to me, or he had heard about what we're doing, and it's just way too liberal, and he was going to call me out on stuff. Just kind of seems from the kind of church he was kind of coming from, and I was able to kind of share that with him, because he turned out to be this youth pastor that just like the pastoral question is so huge for him. He has a large youth group. He's got kids that have lesbian moms. He's got kids who have questions about their gender identity. Yeah, I mean, he is a youth pastor, and a good enough youth pastor that his youth are actually honest with him. So anyway, so those are kind of some of the most fun conversations I get to have, because it's sort of like they want to figure out how to faithfully disciple and lead these kids without kind of shoving their particular ideas or theology down their throats. And oftentimes they're kind of questioning their theology anyway, and they just want somebody who they can kind of talk that out with, that's not going to say, oh, well, your job is at stake here.
Yeah.
And then the youth, of course, that's like my favorite piece. So I get to talk to a lot of teens that are in evangelical homes. Some of them are out to their parents, and others are not. And yeah, I just kind of get to listen to them a lot, and maybe offer some random resources. But for the most part, I just get to be their kind of friend, big sister kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. My work as director of community is kind of twofold. So one is building these groups that we've kind of been referring to, some of the community conversations we have. So seeing hopefully a network of generous space type groups form across Canada. We have 3 of them running right now, and another few that are starting up. So just groups where anybody can come together with these postures and these values that we've been talking about, and have conversations on a regular basis. And then the other side of my work is one-on-one pastoral conversations, whether it's by email, in person, on Skype. And these people are from all over the place, all different ages, different experiences. Some are in mixed orientation marriages, some are ex-gay survivors, some are just coming out, others have been out for a long time and are just re-exploring their relationship with God. But it's just a whole diverse group of people who I am privileged to know and just listen to and learn from them, really, from their experiences. That's my work.
Cool. And just to pause you really quick, in case anyone doesn't know, a mixed orientation marriage.
Yeah. Sorry.
Go ahead.
But it would be a marriage where one of the spouses is heterosexual and the other one is queer of some variety, and
Or they're both queer.
Or maybe they're both queer. They're just different kinds of queer. But anyway, just a mix. So often it'll be it could be somebody who hoped that by getting married to somebody of the opposite sex it might change their orientation, and that didn't work out for them, but they've committed to staying within that marriage, or maybe realized later on after they were already married that they had a different orientation.
Cool. And an ex-gay survivor would be?
That would be somebody who's been through ex-gay therapy or ex-gay groups. Sometimes it's quite harmful emotionally, spiritually, even physically to people. And so a lot of those people who have come through that experience and are now describe themselves as ex-gay or are kind of embracing the fact that they are, or accepting that they are going to be queer. A lot of them call themselves survivors because they see that as having overcome an experience that was quite harmful and painful for them.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Always the insider of the clarify. So now that I have these 2 fantastic folks, the consultative side kind of falls on my plate. And in part, unfortunately, that's because as a mainly straight gal, I can still have a voice in some places that would not invite Beth and Denise because they're married. And so generally speaking, I view part of my role as relinquishing my platform and cultivating a platform for Beth and Denise. Because I think of our history, we are still sort of primarily engaged in the evangelical community, which some days still surprises me. But perhaps evidence of how quickly this conversation has shifted and evolved, and how much turmoil evangelical leaders are in. Evangelical congregations, generally speaking, are diverse. There are people who would affirm marriage equality and those who are traditionally believing. And it erodes the integrity of a community when you have to do a DADT sort of motif, like don't ask, don't tell, secret handshake, whether we can have a real conversation about what we believe about these things. And so I go into those contexts not so much to try to tackle their doctrinal framework, but to work within it to say, how do we open the space? How do we open the conversation? How do we open the dialogue? And surprisingly, yeah, I mean, I was invited to the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada's Denominational Leaders Day about 18 months ago. And so you had extremely conservative, denominational, president doodads. So it was a room full of old, white, married, heterosexual, cisgender men and me. And, you know, and they were saying, we need to have a different kind of conversation. They are not saying we need to change our theology, but they are recognizing that their young people are saying, what the heck, this is a non-issue for us. We've grown up with LGBTQ friends, and they're the best people we know, and I think the church is stupid for making such a big deal about this. And so even the most conservative denominations know that, and they're trying to somehow at least demonstrate to the youth we're at least willing to try to have a slightly different kind of conversation. Christian higher education institutions, Christian colleges, especially those who are being credentialed to offer degrees to a wider public. So the Christian colleges that become universities in Canada, that's very different than being a Bible college in some random middle of the rural buffalo field. Like, so these universities are open regardless of creed, race, orientation, etc., etc. And in the Canadian context, I think they sort of intrinsically realize we're a hair's breadth away from the Human Rights Tribunal if we insist on a certain code of conduct when we are serving a public beyond those who hold to the same set of beliefs. And so they're in this, you know, weird tension of their donor constituency has an expectation of planting the flag for truth, so to speak. But on the other hand, their student body and the larger public, and potentially some of the governing bodies, are asking something very different of them. And so, you know, New Direction kind of comes in and says, well, let me talk to you about this general space thing and see if that might help open the conversation a little so we can bring the anxiety down and actually have a wise and discerning time of reflection together of how now shall we live and how shall we move forward in the context we find ourselves in. Local congregations, Denise mentioned Christian high schools, same kind of deal. Mission agencies that aren't just about evangelizing the gospel, but are also about relief and development. They need to be asking very different questions because, again, they're serving a broader public. And so, in some ways, our phone is ringing off the hook a lot more than it was 5 years ago. And yet, at the same time, there is still a reluctance, a complacency, a slowness, a dragging of the feet. I can have a very robust conversation behind closed doors with all kinds of promises, and then dick squat, nothing happens publicly. And that's just kind of where we are in this season of transition. So we have to try to just you know, not get frustrated and just be faithful and be available and be encouraging and gracious and sometimes be prophetic and sometimes kick some ass. Because I think, you know, the Christian community is very good at hiding in fear, except that the scriptures don't call us to be energized by fear. The scriptures say fear has to do with punishment. Perfect love drives out fear. So there is a time for a prophetic witness that says, get off your ass and choose love, because either God can be trusted with this institution to either maintain it or let it die, heaven forbid, you know, or you're doing something that actually doesn't smell like Jesus and the gospel. Not that I'm passionate about it, Jen.
Well, I don't relate to you at all. Everything you're saying makes no sense to me.
Sorry.
So I'm just gonna you opened up a little something for me when I want to say that I do feel very comfortable with you all speaking with you. I really do relate to a lot of things that you're saying. But when I heard, just a little bit about your organization, and then I dug into your website and checked out Denise's Twitter feed and just started following you today. And as I experienced your website, I was very skeptical because of the history of the organization. And I even read the letter to ex-gay survivors that said, we know you're skeptical. And I was skeptical, right? And I noticed, for me, this language, right? We talk about this insider language, and there's this very Christian language, and I use it too, certainly. But as I read the website, I felt like, is there a secret celibacy agenda? I can't quite pin down, what's happening on this website, and it just feels a little too much like this, even this street Christian language I'm used to, or even anti-gay Christian language I can be used to, and I can't quite pin down what's happening on this website. When I clicked through to Denise's Twitter feed, I was like, okay, that language makes more sense to me. I feel more comfortable. It was I wrote down some of the things oh, my work as a queer activist is grounded in my spirituality. Okay, I'm comfortable in that language. That was, you retweeted, so it was someone else's thing you retweeted, but it was very, but just the fact that you retweeted it, right? And there was a hashtag #2Spirit. There was mention of Leela, the recent suicide by a transgender teen. And so I was like, okay, you know what? I think these people are okay. But
See, these two are our cred. We had to hire a queer married couple just to get some cred.
I wasn't going to say it, but you said it.
Carotid artery, but at least we have some cred with Jenn Yoder.
I think what you're noticing, because this is our problem, Jen, is that just describing the different work that we do as a what are we?
Organization.
Yeah, I was going to say 3 people, but I was going to say trio, and that didn't sound right.
A whole other conversation.
Right, because Denise and I work mostly with queer people, and Wendy works mostly with churches and organizations that primarily are coming from a more traditional perspective. So to have a website that would draw all of those people in without alienating any of them is very difficult, and we've struggled a lot around language and trying to communicate what we want to say without turning someone off right away with the term. So I think we're still trying to tweak that and trying to figure out what language is best.
But I think also I would be the very first to say,
currently you are looking at New Direction. So it is a trio. It's the 3 of us. And we have our fingers in a lot of pies. I currently am serving on a study committee for my denomination. That's taking up a ton of time. I'm trying to finish my doctoral thesis. So the truth is, some of the website language is 4 years old, let's say, which, in another generation, that wouldn't seem too bad. Now it's a nanosecond. So, and I sort of was cringing when you were talking, Jen, because this mainly straight gal wrote most of what's on the website
I'm so sorry.
4 years ago, right? And so I have evolved as a learner in the last 4 years, and this kind of sounds like we're just making excuses, but the truth is it's freaking hard to keep up with a website, especially when ours has as much stuff on it as it does. So it's constantly feeling a little bit like we're behind the 8 ball because we know the feedback that you have given, and we're like, yes, and as we're with people and we're visiting churches and we're and so maybe that sounds whiny and complaining, which I don't mean, but we could hire 5 more people to do the things we're doing because actually the need is that great.
No, I absolutely understand that. I work for a peacemaking organization, and our website's in a similar position. We could really use some updates. So I entirely understand that piece. I was just curious whether it was an intentional, you sort of said you have some access to spaces that like I wouldn't, or Denise and Beth wouldn't. So I didn't know if it was an intentional choice of using that language to, as Beth was saying, open doors to people so that people don't just stop in their tracks, or if it was a matter of
a little bit of both, right? It is a bit of both. And the truth is, this whole arena of engagement is so complex that I always say, look, just take me out for coffee or Skype me, because the heart of everything we do is relational. And when you get into the theoretical, trying to parse language, as important as that is, and we're deeply committed to really investing good energy into our language, but at the end of the day, gosh, let's have a coffee or a shot of Zambuca, because we need to actually have, if we're all about humanizing this conversation, that actually has to happen with human beings. So that's our dilemma. Not just that we're trying to connect with multiple audiences, which is inherently challenging, but that we're fundamentally relational, and we're fundamentally not wanting to be some esoteric conversation out in the virtual world. No, we actually want to have our feet on the ground where our humanity, our embodiedness, our guts matter. And that makes it even more difficult.
Yeah. Thank you for that answer. So we have a couple audience questions, but I'm going to ask probably, for me at least, my hardest question. And forgive me. Are you ready? Forgive me if I get emotional when I'm asking the question, but you mentioned in your very first description that the history of New Directions is painful and important to carry. Don't remember exactly how you said it, but to own, I think. And given the connections that have been made between reparative therapy and suicide, depression, drug use, STD rates, and the negative impact it's had on the lives of queer folks. And given the ways that queer people carry the pain and the damage from that in a daily way, in an ongoing way, given we mentioned Leela earlier, this recent transgender teen who committed suicide, and my partner and I just attended a vigil in Pittsburgh for a trans man who committed suicide by jumping off one of our many bridges here. I guess I wonder, and I know that I hold a lot of anger at ex-gay ministry. I have a lot of friends that have struggled with suicide, thoughts of suicide, with deep depression, with ongoing pain from these ministries and the ways that they've shamed and harmed people. And so I would ask, you know, you're lovely people. I'm enjoying speaking with you and think I relate to all of you in a lot of ways, but somehow I'm angry at New Directions. But you are New Directions, and I think you're fabulous. So I guess, how do you carry that accountability in sort of the same daily way that queer folks who have experienced harm carry their ongoing harm from their experiences?
Yeah, I can't. I wish I could. But the wishing that I could is somehow the inevitable desire to flee from it. The truth is, I can't. But if we had changed the name and tried to just launch a brand of generous space, we would be doing more harm. It is much harder to still be called New Direction when I might run into someone on the street in Toronto who was part of the ministry in 1987 and literally wants to kill me. Mm-hmm. And I'm trying to say that's how deep the pain is, and I want to acknowledge that. That is so hard, but what's harder still is the pride of Christians, the refusal to repent, the refusal to listen, the refusal to acknowledge, the refusal to even be present, let alone even try to imagine somehow to make amends. And so by keeping the name, I say we are trying to be a living apology. So that when we're on this podcast, and I don't so much point to Beth and Denise, but me, I'm a mainly straight gal. I took this role in 2002 when that was still the identity of the ministry. I want to be on this podcast saying, I'm trying to embody something different. I'm trying to embody repentance. I'm trying to embody, the only reason New Direction is now where it is because of those stories, and entering those stories, and grieving and weeping and throwing myself at the foot of the cross and risking everything. Because the LGBTQ community has been lied to and been violated by the hypocrisy of the church. And if I try to run from the history of New Direction, I am being an abuser all over again by not owning that. And so it's painful and it's awful and it's shameful, and I don't know what to do with it. What I do know is that I can't pretend it didn't happen. That will do more violence. So what I can do in the simpleness of my own life is have coffee with an ex-gay survivor and let them scream at me for 2 hours and weep and be present with them in whatever way I might participate with them in dismantling those barriers that have prevented them from flourishing because they were hurt and they're bitter and they're pissed off and they're mad at God and they lost their faith. New Direction. If I can at least be present and say, you're right. Yes. That's right. That's the least I can do. And I don't pretend that that's going to fix anything or heal anything. But sometimes I'm surprised that God's grace breaks through and there is gradual transformation. And that I'm humbled by, because I think God's grace is ridiculous. Because on a human level, how do you forgive that? How do you, we had a screening, and we had a gentleman from PFLAG in Toronto, an older gentleman who didn't quite follow some of the things I was saying about New Direction. And he stood up and he said, how do you live with blood on your hands? And how do you live with thousands of teenagers who killed themselves? And I happened to have brought my 12-year-old daughter to that screening. And my 12-year-old daughter is sitting there, frightened for her mother, crying her eyes out. And I'm trying to mother my child and be present for this gentleman. And that's why we need Jesus, right? Like, this is the stuff of the world. And I think it would be horrifically audacious of me to pretend I somehow have an answer to that. I don't. I'm present. I'm willing to be present. And I don't think that's enough, but it's what I can do. And I have to trust God's grace is bigger than this of 30 years of ex-gay ministry that destroyed so many lives. And it isn't about me at all, but I will honestly say that as a mainly straight gal who had a lot of trauma in my life and was sucked into the same kind of healing paradigm, that I have to somehow get whole, and I somehow have to deal with my mother issues and my father issues, and I have to do all this stuff so God will love me and I'll be okay in the church. You know, the weird thing is that there's some affinity and some identification that I personally did, and the evolution of New Directions probably saved my own faith. It's introduced me to a generous God and a loving God, and my own Christianity was so driven by shame and fear that I have been liberated as New Direction has evolved. And it's not about me, but I am eternally grateful. And so that means I'm willing to try to be present, because I do believe that there's more. There's more generosity of God. There's more love. There's more than I ever imagined. And if by owning all of this crap altogether, somehow that message finds a crack, then I'll be grateful and humble.
And I think you named, I was in conversation earlier today with another scholar, and we were talking about accountability, and I think you named one of the most difficult parts of it, sort of the things the history is for you. It's painful and it's uncomfortable, and it's to have the name New Directions, right? And to have that history, and I think that's I've seen a lot in Christian spaces a desire to skip over. Can we skip the accountability? Can we skip the part where it's uncomfortable and it hurts, and we acknowledge pain and we acknowledge culpability maybe, and we acknowledge there's no way we can go back in time and undo the harm we've done, and we've left damaged people in our wake. Can we just skip that and get to reconciliation? And so I appreciate that answer, and that you sit with it, and that it is, and it still is, and it will be until it's not.
Yeah.
All right, let's look at all of these good questions that we have here. And the first is from Shane, and it is, do you think that the position of generous spaciousness is sustainable? As in, can a community embrace a generous spaciousness point of view indefinitely? Is that a space to stay in, or is there somewhere next? I think is sort of the thought.
Yeah, in the book, I'm actually quite clear that I think this is a word to the church in a season of transition. So I don't think it's a final word. I think it's a word on the journey and process. The kicker is, though, I don't know when the season of transition is going to end, or how it will end, or so I don't think it's the final word, but probably for most of my lifetime, it'll be a needed word, where there's entrenchment and polarity and violence in our diversity. I think it's a needed word. Would I rejoice if it wasn't needed anymore and I could retire and go write novels, yeah, especially if it was a warm tropical island. But so on one hand, I work to work myself out of a job, but on the other hand, I think it's going to be a while, unfortunately. Partly just because the body of Christ is so diverse, and partly because we are not just local contexts. In a world of technology, we are a global church, and heaven knows the work on a global level is beyond my lifespan. Which is why, I want my grandkids to say, Granny Wendy was on the right side of history, and we're now in China and Africa and Asia, working for peace, working for the humanization of all people, working to dismantle barriers to flourishing all over, of which gender sexuality is significant, but only one aspect. I have never wanted to ghettoize this reality. It is really the larger question of what does it mean to be the people of God in the world that has so much brokenness. And I know that the word brokenness can be a trigger, so I really just want to say, but then I'll get in trouble. So, I've already dropped F-bomb.
It's fine.
Excellent.
Yeah, I would add on, something Wendy has said as well. I do think that the sexuality, gender question won't always be at the forefront in the church, but there's always going to be a need for this posture. Gender spaciousness, I think, like Wendy said, gender spaciousness applies to all sorts of things. Like, who knows what the next big thing will be that the church has to wrestle with, but this is almost a case study. And can we actually act like mature disciples as we discuss and wrestle with this one? And then will that make us more mature as we tackle the next big thing that we disagree about in the church? So I think there's always a need for that brave space or that generous space kind of to be fostered, no matter what the issue is that we're talking about.
We're totally stealing that.
Yeah, we're going to use it.
So good.
So the next question, and you've talked a lot about generous spaciousness, so maybe we could take this as a specific example of something you'd say to someone who is afraid. But the next question is, how do we combat the fear that silences public openness and honesty in this conversation? So
The first thing that comes to my mind is that fear and love are opposites in 1 John, that you overcome fear with love. And I know that that can sound cliche because we use it a lot, but I do think that silence is a big problem right now. People don't feel like there are safe spaces or whatever kind of spaces we're talking about where they can be open and honest. And there's great things at stake. There's careers, there's jobs, there's even lives at stake sometimes in this conversation. So I understand the fear that's there and the way it silences people. So I think when we are we can't really change a lot but our own selves, like what we can control. So if we can make ourselves people who are willing to hold tension and willing to stand in places that are uncomfortable and to listen to different sides of something, different places on the spectrum, then we can start to be that change. And people, I think, sometimes model their behavior after other people. So if we can take leadership in our own churches and in our own communities, modeling that kind of non-anxious presence, the kind of love that takes, then I think it starts to catch, starts to sort of be contagious towards other people. Maybe that's too idealistic of a response, but you want to be cynical?
Angry lesbian? I don't know. I think, yeah, I think I got hung up on a lot of different words in the question. I know, but I keep reading it and I still don't know. I feel like yeah, your answer was better because it was a lot more general. I kept trying to think of really specific public spaces where we should be having this conversation, and that just kind of got muddy for me. But yeah, I think kind of just riffing off of what Beth just said, I think the first person that breaks that silence helps for kind of a stream, like just like in any kind of situation when in like a classroom, like you have one question and all of a sudden you've got 25 questions. And so I think it really just takes one person that is going to say, yeah, I'm like terrified to speak up, but I'm still going to do it because I know that or because you tell yourself that even though you don't know, there are 100 other people afraid of speaking up, like that want to say something as well. And so I think that's the only way any church enters this conversation is because one person said, hey, this is important to me. And then 100 other people hopefully said, actually, yeah, this is important as well.
And you have to count the cost because there can be a huge cost to being that one person. And I recognize that. I think it's a way of taking up your cross. I think it's laying down your life in a lot of ways when you're being that one that starts the conversation.
I think I also say, though, that we need to be innocent as a dove and shrewd as a serpent. I am not an advocate of cheap martyrdom. But if you're going to martyr yourself, take the hill with you. So I think even, I'm sure, Jen, you're aware of the older Mennonite dude who is now retired, who writes this letter to Mennonites saying that he married his son, and I don't know, he got this girl something or other. He officiated the marriage for his son. Yeah, well, she knows who I'm talking about. No, but I just want to clarify the language. It wasn't like a real marriage. So yeah, officiated. But so this is an older guy who's retired and makes a strategic accounting of the cost because, he's not going to be crucified into obscurity. His letter carries some weight. Now, which is not to have an excuse to not step up, but I think we need to be wise about when we step up and have the long view in mind. I think there are those who kind of storm the beach, but then there's those who plan the whole battle and already anticipate. I don't like to use battle language, but I'm not coming up with another metaphor. I think there are activists who, really, are the pioneers who break ground and are radical. Then there's a long time, which I call advocacy, around people, not issues. And they tend to be in it for the longer haul. They are risk-taking as well, but maybe a little more at the risks. And there needs to be collaboration. And I say this to other leaders in this conversation. There is no room for territorialism. There is enough work for all of us. We must cooperate and collaborate together, partly because that's a witness to Jesus, and partly it's just wise. I'm not going to compete with Matthew Vines about who sells more books. I hope we both sell books because his book is going to reach a slightly different part of the body than my book is, than Kathy Baldock's book, than Mark Optemeyer's book, than Ken Wilson's book, than Dushy's book, than all the cool Mennonites books. So we need to have the courage, I think, to find solidarity as critical mass through testimony and consistent, non-anxious, calm public engagement that is civil. I think is the long-term strategy, that we need to maintain the practices of the heart that will enable us to be gracious consistently in and out of controversy, in and out of conflict, no matter what names are thrown at us, no matter what accusations are thrown at us, no matter which way we are misrepresented in the public, to consistently try to embody the way of Jesus. Because at the end of the day, Jesus said, you know a good tree by the good fruit it bears. And so if we are bearing good fruit, at some point, I beg mercy for the person who would try to, discredit fruit that is clearly consistent with the ways of Jesus and empowered by the Holy Spirit.
And awesome. That's my response. And I think I'm having too many thoughts. I can't pick just one. So I think oh no, wait, okay. I'll give you the next really very important question. Get ready. Wes Patterson asks, so how does the New Direction team continue to look so fantastic? Discuss.
We practiced posing before the podcast.
You learned it all from me.
We would look a lot more fantastic if Wes was here, and we absolutely blame the Canadian government for screwing up this paperwork.
While we're asking funny questions, I have a really also very important question. Have you seen the movie But I'm a Cheerleader?
More like how many times have we seen it?
Do you realize how close your name is to the name of the ex-gay camp in But I'm a Cheerleader?
Yeah, isn't it New Directions? Or is it, what is it again?
It's True Directions.
Sorry, I'm culturally.
We're gonna have to have
it's a cult classic. If you haven't seen it, it's hilarious.
We have to see it.
RuPaul is in it.
Netflix, everybody.
It's amazing.
It's pretty great.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Important question answer.
Yay, Denise, for saving our ass on that one.
Whenever I told
see, this is my cred right here.
Whenever I told anyone I was interviewing New Direction Ministries, they were like, "What? That camp from But I'm a Cheerleader?" Close.
We should probably
do sometimes get mixed up with One Direction.
Oh yeah, a couple people did ask me that. Yeah.
One Direction.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, back to questions from me. So I'm gonna ask a question that I'm not sure if this is just specific to the Mennonite Church, or I'm curious if you've seen this in your work. And it's a kind of difficult question. In the Mennonite Church, there is often this dichotomy set up. You sort of brushed on this earlier when you were talking about the broader church and the broader issues in the church. There are obviously racial justice issues in the Mennonite Church. Struggle with racism and with our whiteness. And there is often a false dichotomy sort of posted up that we cannot work on queer justice issues and racial justice issues at the same time. And that there's often this idea sort of posted, and that among communities of color, there's a monolithic view that of traditional beliefs. So, which would also sort of imply that there's no queerness among communities of color.
None at all.
And so therefore, if we are really supporting our Christian communities of color, our Mennonite communities of color, then we can't talk about queer justice or queer people. And of course, that's a false dichotomy, and of course, that puts queer folks in a really difficult position. It puts people of color in a really difficult position, and it puts queer people of color in an especially difficult position in the Mennonite Church. And so I'm wondering if you've encountered that and how you've dealt with it or worked with it, if you have encountered that.
I think Canada is a slightly different context in relation to racism than America, because we're not so much dealing with white and black, we're literally dealing with a rainbow, and our cultural way of welcoming newcomers to Canada is, there is a certain commitment nationally to honor the distinctiveness of cultures, which I wish I could say has permeated through the Canadian church, which, you know, I think churches are absolutely, despite years of commitment, are still grappling with justice in that regard. But the world around us, you know, if any one of us goes to a grocery store, we might not hear English at all, and we might be the minority in terms of our presentation of ethnicity. So there's that sort of context. Then, you know, justice is justice. Flourishing is flourishing. Removing barriers is removing barriers. There was this slightly weird conversation on, is it Christians for Biblical Equality, where some people were saying, you can't talk about gender justice without talking about LGBT matters. And other people were like, yes, we can. You know, we want men and women to have equal roles in home and church, but we're not, you know, talking about alternative lifestyles. And I think that we do really well at compartmentalizing in the church. And I think Jesus challenged that by flipping everything upside down and inside out. And you either kind of internalize and connect to a trajectory of inclusiveness and justice and a hermeneutic of love that is this progressive revelation of God's story in the world, or you don't. I mean, like if you have internalized that sense of this is what God's movement in the world is, this is what God's, you know, vision and imagination of redemption has been from before the beginning of time, take this particular people so that we would be a house of prayer for all the nations and all peoples. You're kind of either in that river and swimming, or you're on the bank having a committee meeting. But you guys are maybe more brilliant.
I was just going to say congratulations for a non-war metaphor.
I don't think I swore in that.
Yeah, I think I make that assumption sometimes wrongly when I meet a person who's queer and a person of color, that I remember I met one person, I said, oh, that must have been really hard for your family, and she actually took offense to that and said, actually, I think my family has dealt well because they've known what it means to feel excluded already, and so I think they understood that I felt doubly excluded because of this. So I think it can go either way, and obviously on our staff we don't have great representation of color or of gender at the moment even. So so we do rely on members of our community who have that that sort of experience of being of a different race or even different faith backgrounds, or an experience of being an immigrant, because I think that can introduce different dynamics into the conversations around coming out and inclusion in church, especially when you're attending a church that is primarily coming from one culture. I don't pretend to understand all those dynamics, but we do long for our community to be more diverse, I would say, in general.
And the value of hospitality, the core values of God, I have a question associated with each of the values, just for us simple-minded folks to quickly remember what is that. And the question connected to hospitality is what voices are missing from the conversation, including those that are living with the reality of multiple marginality. And how do we continue to recognize where we are in the center and move to the margins so that that voice comes into the conversation in recognition that we're impoverished unless we hear from a person living with a disability, a person living with a different ethnicity in the minority, or like, you know, it's kind of like we're on a treasure hunt to find every marginality there is because the story isn't complete without the reference and their lens. And we want to be a learning community. We want to hear those stories and again relinquish our platform to create a platform for that person who's living with more marginality than some of us are. But it's long been my lament that our communities has some colors, some cappuccino, a little chocolate, but basically it's a very vanilla conversation. In the church, it's largely a vanilla conversation amongst cisgender straight people. And so, again, it's me saying, how can I relinquish my platform and create that platform for someone who's not been in the conversation?
So, you mentioned churches that are primarily another culture. In the and the sort of difference between Canada and the U.S. And in the U.S., I heard the statistic on a recent podcast, but I forget. But it's like maybe 9% of churches that are pretty integrated, and then most churches are very racially segregated. Is that the case in Canada? And are you working with churches? And how do you approach working with churches that are culturally different? How do you make sure you acknowledge your whiteness and are being culturally appropriate and are working on undoing oppressions of all kinds as you do the work?
It's a both and. I think there is strong desire to cultivate intercultural churches, but there are also a lot of ethnically homogenous churches, often comprised of newcomers to Canada, where services might not at all be in English. And where a church is intercultural, there's a good springboard in the sense of that community has had to learn to extend space to someone who is quite other to them. They smell different, they eat different food, they dress different, they sing different, they pray different, they want different things for the church to do, and so they've grown in making space for that. One of the challenges in that situation is if there are a lot of newcomers and they're coming from cultural contexts where socially gender and sexual identity aren't even on the radar, it's this question of how do we not do violence within our community when there are very different points of readiness amongst different folks in our midst. To be honest, we have a lot of traction with the ethnic-based churches at this point, although we have a mainline denomination in Canada, the United Church of Canada, that's been sort of officially affirming since the 80s, and they have quite a few ethnically homogenous congregations. And one of their executives, who is queer and knows us, was reading my book, wondering if my book might be a bridge to those churches within a denomination that has that kind of an affirming history. So I think there's a lot of sort of different points where there's careful discernment, wondering, curiosity, openness to say, how can we pastor the entire body of Christ? How can we say, look, there are different parts in the body, they have different functions, but one part cannot say to another part, I have no need of you. And So how can we open this conversation, and how do we discern what the entry points are? And I know sometimes that's my conversation with denominational leaders, because that is a significant part of where their church is growing. So they don't want to cause disruption or conflict or schism amongst their ethnic churches, because that's giving them good stats, you know. So like there's all kinds of just complex factors involved in trying to engage different parts of the body, even sometimes within one denomination. Of course, where we see it, one inevitable entry point, second generation kids who are being educated in liberal arts public colleges or universities in Canada, those who are queer, who come out, or even just those who have been in queer-friendly campuses, and that rift sometimes, unfortunately, is enough of a motivation to say, gosh, we need to talk about this, because it is causing this conflict and this separation between first and second generation. You know, I don't feel like I would choose that entry point, but sometimes that becomes a catalyst to have a different kind of conversation.
And I've noticed this too, and you've mentioned it a couple of times, that youth, right? So maybe it's second generation, maybe it's just younger people in general. So the future of the church, right, theoretically, are more welcoming. Maybe it's a non-issue, or maybe it's actually a really important issue, this issue of welcome and acceptance. And I've noticed just in the 10 years that I've been doing this sort of advocacy work, this shift. You've talked about that tension too. And I'm wondering if I can relate this to Jamie's question about fear and silence and speaking up. What I've noticed is that people are scared, right? People who hold this traditional view are feeling the earth shifting underneath their feet. And where I'm used to folks coming from a position of power, right, and telling me I don't belong and I can't be in that space, and that's shifting a little bit to where my voice is getting lifted up a little more sometimes. And the voices of my generation and younger folks, queer or straight or however they identify, are moving into positions of leadership and moving into pastoral positions, and their voices are getting louder, and there are more of those voices. And as this happens, some people, although they're still coming from a position of privilege and power, are also coming from a position of fear and feeling like they're becoming irrelevant. I guess, does it change? Have you had to change, or are you seeing a change in the way that you're interacting and making space for those people in a different way as they're more scared, I guess, where I used to feel like I had to sort of elbow my way into spaces and, take up space and say, here's my voice, this is what I'm saying, you need to listen, right? Now I'm finding I have to make some approaches of like, hey, I really still like you, really still a nice person, and I'm being invited into spaces that I wouldn't have been invited to before. I would make the bold statement that I wouldn't have been asked to do this interview, and you might have been asked to be on it 2 years ago, 3 years ago, last year, I don't know, 5 years ago. So how are you navigating this shifting space that sometimes maybe you're given more, maybe it's just token, or maybe it's real power in these conversations?
Well, it is a crazy time right now. I mean, depending on where you live and what sort of denomination you're part of and where it's at, you can be in vastly different places as a person. There's I mean, within our own denomination that Denise and I grew up in, we were pastoring and seeking ordination, and when we started to decide that we were going to marry one another and come out publicly, we weren't able to do that anymore. So there is no position of power for us within, or a position of having a voice really within that denomination in that way. So that's when New Direction offered us these jobs, giving us, again, a platform to be able to speak. So it's kind of like a shifting environment, and I'm sure there's still a lot of even kids like Leela and others who are in places where they feel like they have zero voice and zero power. But at the same time, there is a cultural shift happening, and what you were saying was reminding me of Allison Robinson did an address at the Reformation Project conference, I think a couple months ago, it's online, and she's a trans pastor in a Baptist church in the States, I think in BC, and she was challenging the queer Christian community about how they would react to this shift and how they would respond, whether they would take the position again of being dominant and oppressive towards those who used to have that upper hand and now are sort of lower on the totem pole, or whether they would take a more humble and gracious and Christ-like approach. And I found it a very challenging address, and I think it's something that queer people in general, not just Christians, have to start to think about now that it's becoming trendy to, for companies to advertise using queer people and things that you never thought would happen. How are we going to take that position? How are we going to hold that? What kind of posture will we hold it with? And I think it is a different kind of challenge. What would you say?
Well, I was just thinking about, like, you use the really common phrase, like, you have a future church, our church's future. And I think as long as we're not advocating for space for youth, like, regardless of kind of where they are socially in regards to the LGBT question or anything like that, as long as we're not making space for our young people to actually be the church's present, I think that's a problem. Like, I think we take our youth seriously. And so taking the fact that, yeah, like, it's kind of becoming a non-issue. I mean, especially in urban centers, like here in Canada, I would assume states as well. Bigger cities, if they're growing up in high school, they actually know out queer kids, and they're not the devil, and more than that, they're their best friends. Like, Wendy's often talks about her kids, all of her kids' friends are queer. Like, it seems like, right? Like, and so, and I mean, like, I don't know, when I came out to a part of my family, one of my brothers said, yeah, like, come on, my kids they grew up on Glee, like, which is not the greatest example of giving queer voices a chance. Certainly don't want to say that, but yeah, like, it's just a different conversation. But that, by all means, does not mean that we just, well, they're youth and they don't have wisdom or whatever.
So we were talking about that. I guess I'll just talk for a little bit. We were talking about that.
Go for it.
That cultural shift and how we make space for, in particular, people who are feeling really scared that they're losing the faith of their childhood, the faith of their families, and the faith they grew up with, because sometimes that's what a shift or a change feel like for people. And that's something that I've been in conversation with denominational leaders about as well, that they've been, something that Beth was talking about, which was when we do end up in positions of power or of equal footing, or as the majority maybe shifts to being queer welcoming, how do we continue to make space for people who have other beliefs and other values? And I think for folks who are listening as Mennonites, that this is something that the Mennonite Church has really been grappling with itself. as we saw this recent survey that came out and really showed that large portion of credentialed pastors, this was particularly surveying, support some form of welcome for queer folks. And so that's a shift that we're familiar with as a church, and that our denominational structure is grappling with. How do we stay together with these folks who are afraid they're losing the faith of their childhood, and they see the shift happening and it feels very scary. And then how do folks who hold this, what's becoming a majority opinion, continue to hold space, hold this generous space, this brave space for them. But I will let you return to what you were talking about, which was, I'm sorry we lost you. I think about when you were saying, talking about all of her friends being queer, all of her children's friends being queer.
Yeah, and then I just ranted for a while, but I think in short, what I was trying to say was that we often, the voices of both our youth and our older folks, like we often don't give enough credit to folks that have really lived for a long time. And so I think, I don't know if you already caught this bit, but I was just talking about how when we were visiting church after church on this road trip, and I would often kind of assume that the older folks in the crowd would be a lot more kind of conservative. And every single time they surprised me by being some of the most kind of open people in the audience. And so I think just recognizing that the marginalized voices in churches are usually on either end of the generational spectrum, and we put a lot of weight on the people in the middle that have a lot of opinions and are kind of out to prove that they know what's what. And it's often the people that are willing to say, we know a lot more about the fact that we know more about what we don't know. We're more aware of what we don't know than we know. I think those are the people that we need to listen to more, especially in the church. There's also the dynamic that we are, in Canada, we are not just post-Christendom. We're pretty much post-Christian, which also means we're moving rapidly towards a post-denominational reality. So the denominational tribes are no longer pure bloodlines. Like, we're all mudbloods, right? People going to the church, not always for the best reasons, but because they like the worship, or there's a good youth program, or they like the preacher. And so you have this mixture in the pews of, Anabaptists with just war people, and they never talk about it because church is a time to, sing with a rock band. But my kids, who are 16, 17, 16, and 14, all have their birthdays, like, not only are they post-denominational, they're post-church. Like, the idea that I'm going to get them engaged in my denomination, like, I just hope that they're wanting to still talk about spirituality and have a robust, question-filled conversation about the story of God in the world. And so what spirituality is going to look like for them, like, I think, wake up, church. You are propping up an institution that the next generation has no interest in maintaining. Like, you think about the dollars to sustain these buildings and programs and infrastructure of denominational offices. And I'll tell you, my kids, they're not going to support that. They're not going to invest their life in that. I hope that I can get them ignited with a redemptive vision to work for Shalom in the world, regardless of it. So sometimes I think you miss the forest for the trees, people. You're so freaked out about who has power now, queer people or believing people. It's like, hey, what about the Jesus story in the world? Which, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying the conversation isn't important. Obviously, I'm giving my life to it. But I want to hold that loosely because I want to have an eye to the next generation who are going to be asking questions in very different contexts. And I want to be alert and have an imagination for something that looks radically different than what I'm trying to engage today.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Yep. With you. We have another question from Jamie. Who says, a lot of Christians express desire to participate in mission rather than simply be the issue. That may be my primary thing that I say to Mennonites all the time is, I'm not an issue, I'm a person who's part of the church with a partner and a dog and a life and feelings and, bones and a soul, and I sneeze when I have a cold. Like, I'm not an issue. So thanks, Jamie. A lot of queer Christians express desire to participate in mission rather than simply be the issue, which is also part of what you were just talking about. How do we make that space for queer Christians?
I'm going to throw some crazy thoughts in. You guys will say something wise and make up for my craziness. But honestly, I think we have to be willing to say, through the protocols and the programs and the sending agencies, which also unfortunately means through the funding, like God's on a mission, and there are a whole lot of innovative, creative, entrepreneurial ways that we can participate with God without, like a certain, what do you do, the knighting with the sword, and, like you get the title and the credentials and the paperwork and the, the commissioning and the support, and, I think, again, the fruit of people's lives is going to change radically, not just people's attitudes and how they think about theology. It's going to like subvert everything. So my hope is that there's a multiplicity of strategies that we're focusing. Some will go through the traditional routes and they'll kind of, be the pioneer and break the hard ground and all that stuff. But I think some have to go on a completely different way where there's no map and see God show up in unpredictable, surprising, outrageous ways. I think some of the most innovative mission can come from the queer community because they have had to embody a subversive faith and a resilient faith, and they know what it is to, it sucks to be queer in a Christian, but it sucks to be Christian in the, can I say it right? It sucks to be queer in the Christian community and Christian in the queer. Anyway, you know what I mean? Both. So they're trying to live in this tension and find integrity and authenticity in the midst of it. So I want to see social entrepreneurship. I want to see, fair trade practices. I want to see, this holistic, integrative presence in the world that the church says, we're dying, we don't have any money. Oh, look what's thriving and vibrant, and look what's having an impact in the world. And maybe get away from, our Christianese and our Christianized world to have a much bigger vision. And I think queer people can have the imagination for that vision. You see something else. That was good.
I don't know if this is right, but I think that it's not about the Christian community making room for queer people to participate in the mission of God. I think God's already making that room, and it's up to Christians to figure out how they can participate in the mission that God is calling queer people to. I think it's listening to the queer people that are either in your community or next door to your community. I think I don't know. I have trouble with like having to the ones that come up with the good ideas and then invite people on board. And really, the work has already been done, and people are already on mission by holding those two things, like Wendy said, like how many times do I talk to college students who don't know how to be Christian in their queer clubs, and then they go to church and they kind of have to like take off their queer, and you know, and so for somebody to be holding those two things, I think is a massive mission in the world. So I don't know. And I think that there are plenty of Christian spaces for queer people to participate. Like if we're talking about the more kind of Christian box stuff, like whatever, leading worship or teaching Sunday school, if there isn't space in your church for them to do that, you can find it elsewhere.
I think we've been using the word queer a lot, and it's not the most popular word in the church, but one of my favorite uses of that word is as a verb. And I think what we're really talking about is queering mission, queering call, and like finding something new and different that doesn't fit into the normal Christian boxes. Because as queer people, we don't really fit into boxes anyways. So how do we get beyond the into new wineskins? I think that's what sort of queer language gets at, and I'm excited about seeing new things that will form because people are approaching things kind of sideways and slantways instead of like we usually do.
And I've always, in the past, I've been a bit nervous about using the word queer because what business does a middle-aged male straight gal have using that word? And slowly, you know, I'm beginning to use it more because to me, I'm queer in the sense that I think queer is an inclusive. It's saying, you know, if you're challenging some of these, you know, externally imposed expectations on who you are and how you function in the world. Now, you know, I'm not going to start sounding my name queer Wendy or anything because I know that I'm a person of privilege and I want to be attuned and sensitive to that. But exactly what Beth said, I mean, it's such a threatening term, and yet there's a beauty that I hope somehow we can convey, that there's hope and there's welcome and there's more room in being able to have a new imagination and more room at the table. And for that reason, I hope that somehow queer can, I mean, it was really hard just to get Exodus people to say I'm gay. I mean, I know that I'm like, you know, in another stratosphere. Queer becoming a more embraced language in a larger church, but I think there's a lot of life that we could get over our that's going to be a long interview. Deteriorating.
Yeah, and we are almost at the end here. I have like 12 more questions I want to ask you, but I guess I don't have time for all of that. But
come to Toronto, sit you up for a beer, and then we'll talk about it.
Sounds great. Definitely coming up there for my work sometime. So.
Oh, great! Look us up.
And there was one question from a tweeter who asked sort of about more of my story, how what you're saying is resonating with me. So I will write a reflection and talk a little more about that. But we definitely don't have time for it right now.
Look forward to it.
Oh, thanks. And I've really enjoyed speaking with you, and yeah, it's been really affirming and good to hear about the work that you're doing up there. Just for the last piece, if you want to sort of share any last thoughts with folks, if you want something specific to talk about, you know, maybe giving people sort of actions they can do to create generous spaces in their contexts, or just any last thoughts that you want to share.
Well, one of the things I'm mindful of is that not only is this live, but I understand it's going to be archived as a video. And we are in a challenging place in the sense that we're talking to Jenn, Yoder, Queer Menno, and so it's, there's this energy of wanting to talk about queer stuff, and it's, this trajectory, and the reality is that, I am serving on a study committee in a denomination that has a very clear, traditionally believing doctrinal position. And I'm already on the hot seat with people assuming I have an end game in mind, and I'm somehow being underhanded with all this talk about gender spaciousness. And they might listen to a video like this and say, well, not only does she swear way too much, she's a Christian, but she also has this great time with this queer menno lady, so obviously she has this agenda. And part of it, I just think. So I think what I want to say is not getting defensive, but to say I deeply believe that making space and being alert to pursuing justice in a humanizing way that does consider all the people gathered in, not only those with this or that need or hope, or and certainly that means a particular sensitivity to those who have been oppressed, those who have experienced violence. But I believe this is Jesus' vision for the body of Christ. We're not going to be uniform. That's not going to happen this side of heaven. We're not all going to agree. We're not all going to have the same interpretation of Scripture on 10 billion things. But how do we, because we're created in the image of God, how do we humanize one another? Because if we do, that's worship. That's giving our Creator glory, because we honor one another and want one another to experience abundant life. And so for those who want to attribute intentions that I don't think are my intentions, I want to say very clearly that even though I think the church is and I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing, I love the church because the church is the people of God in the world. And I want, in that sense, the people of God in the world to be built up and to be mature and to actually be about the work of God in the world. And those are the reasons I participate. I mean, I love queer people, but if that was the only reason I was doing this, I don't think I would be as faithful as I hope I am in having a bigger vision of what it means to be God's people, having a glimpse of God's heart for a restored world, and actually participating with Him in that. And so those who make this about politics or about liberal theology or destroying inerrancy of the Bible or whatever they want to say it is, I think please hear the heart that says this is my Father's world. I'm unified with a Trinitarian God who loves this world and wants to restore and redeem it, and I, as faithfully as I can, participate with Him in that work, and that's what we want to do through New Direction. Maybe you guys can say some practical things.
Yeah, I think I would just say, I mean, this is our first little hangout of this variety, and I think in general, the online world has opened us up to so many more opportunities to connect with people. So I think as we go, I would just say that for Denise and I, our work, we love to connect with people online, and we would love for you guys to follow us on Facebook, on Twitter, read our blog at our New Direction, and get connected that way. We're also building networks across Canada especially, but even sometimes in the States, of people who kind of are buying into this idea of creating these generous spaces and want to be public about that and be mentors for other people or start groups that might welcome folks from different perspectives. So if you're interested in that, get in touch with us. Yeah, and it helps us to feel less isolated and less alone. We can connect even in these virtual ways. I think it's really life-changing.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I was going to say. Like, if people find kind of value in
broader community that can talk about this stuff. Like we're here, like we're not just doing podcasts. Like, we welcome interaction or whatever level. And yeah, and if your church is even considering having this conversation, then like especially in Canada, like we're open to hosting conversations and hosting. I don't really consult, but yeah, if you're like work with you, I would love to connect with you. And or if you know you like the benefit from the youth pastor that is not going to judge them for whatever their questions might be.
Well, thank you so much for talking with us at MennoNerds. And everyone who's watching, they are available. Their website is easy to find. I spent a lot of time on it. And you can call them or email them or tweet them. And they have, my perspective of just talking with them, I think a lot that they could offer our Mennonite churches or any church you might attend. Or you personally, if you're just having some questions. So thank you again. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you too.
Yeah, I will look you up.
Great.
When you come to Toronto, seriously,
Yeah.
we got some good, local brewed stuff. And I don't know about the coffee. Where are you from? Like, maybe our coffee is good. We have some good micro coffee. Yeah, some good micro breweries. So.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone who was tuning in.
Thanks a lot, Jen. See you later.
Thank you.